everyone, welcome to the June 1st edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and we are looking ahead to Belmont's Saturday card. We're going to take a look at the late pick 5 sequence at Belmont. It is races 6 through 10, featuring their stakes race on Saturday, the Grade 2 Pennine Ridge for the 3-year-olds going a mile and an eighth. That race, of course, serves as the local prep for the Grade 1 Belmont Derby, which they will run on that Stars and Stripes card in early July, and got some nice 3-year-old turf horses in that race, and I'm sure we'll be looking ahead to a clash of some good 3-year-olds in that Belmont Derby coming up in about a month's time. But as we look at this entire pick 5 sequence, it's a nice mix of races. That Pennine Ridge is the only stakes involved, but we do have a pretty competitive allowance race on the turf to kick it off. We've got a maiden turf race that seems to have some high quality runners in it, a New York Bred allowance race that features one runner coming from the Derby Trail, and also a pretty perplexing New York Bred maiden claiming race to close things out. So not the easiest sequence, Craig.
Yeah, we're gonna have to start talking about these a little more beforehand, where we could have took some low-hanging fruit at Churchill, I think. No, I'm just kidding, of course, but these are difficult races. I didn't find any of them where I would be super comfortable if I was to go only one or two deep, to be honest. It's just a really tough sequence.
Craig usually defers to me to make these decisions about which sequences to handicap, and I was kind of trying to decide between Churchill and Belmont, and I thought that there was a little more to sink your teeth into at Belmont in terms of finding some prices, but that can both be a good and bad thing when you're trying to put together a pick 5 sequence, so we'll have to see how that all works out when we get to the end of this podcast. But Craig, I think we're going to begin this discussion with one of the most difficult races in the sequence, the 6th race. It's an N1X allowance event, going 6 furlongs on the inner turf. And do note that this week at Belmont, the rail setting on the inner turf is at 35 feet, and that's why they're listed as about distances on the inner turf at Belmont in all of these inner turf races this week, because there's difficulties timing these races and weird run-ups. I know that's something that's given Cred a headache in the past, so I think just to allay some of those concerns about fractional times that look weird, these are just labeled as about distances. But these 10 fillies and mares will be traveling that 6 furlong distance. And Craig, with that rail setting at 35 feet, they're limited to only 10 runners in this race. And that might be a good thing, because this race would have been even more difficult if some of the also eligibles drew in.
Yeah, it would be, and I'll be honest, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on the also eligibles. I gave them a look, so if some draw in, I have some opinions, but I didn't go crazy on them. As far as the rail goes, I will say the one thing is that at least we know there was a time in racing where we wouldn't have known these things. We would have just been given times and been left to figure it out on our own. But things are getting better on that front, so maybe eventually they'll be able to time all the races they're going to run, but until then, at least they're giving us the most information they can.
Well, I'll just kick off our discussion of these contenders, Craig, by mentioning one of the also eligible entrants. And I know you didn't give us, an in-depth look to them, but I just will say that if the number 11 Cadencia draws into the race, and she just needs one scratch to do so, she would be a major player in here. She's a horse that I would definitely use. She's got good tactical speed and seems like she's really found a home sprinting on turf for the William Morey barn, and William Morey has been winning at a very high rate recently all around the country, and also doing well at Belmont Park, and she put in a dominating performance against weaker horses last time out going this distance. So she is the kind of horse that I would not ignore if she drew into this field, but we will spend some more time discussing the horses that were drawn into the main body of this race. And boy, I had a tough time making a morning line in this race. I didn't know where the public would go, so when I'm confused in these situations, I often just default to making Irad Ortiz the favorite, since that's often what the public does, and he's riding the number 4 Diamond Hands in here, and I could certainly see her taking money going out for the Todd Pletcher barn. She's got speed figures that certainly put her in the mix, but I'm not convinced that she's necessarily a turf sprinter, and it feels like they're just trying to try something new with a horse that has had trouble getting to the winner's circle recently.
Yeah, I'm of the same opinion. I have her on my list for I'm not going to use her. I mean, if she beats me, she beats me. She's probably going to be the favorite in here. I have no argument with your line. I think we even have her picked on top in the Timeform US Power picks based on her speed figures. But this is a pretty big change for a horse who isn't winning. I think they're just looking for a way to get to the winner's circle, but she's never run less than 7.5 furlongs. I would like her more if the cut was to six, but all the way, I mean, to seven, but all the way back to 6 furlongs. That's quite a change, especially on turf. And even though she's shown some tactical speed in some of her route races, most of them have blue fractions. And I'm just leery that she's going to be way overbet in this spot on just a lot of question marks about her.
Yeah, and she's a front running type, and I'm often leery of these horses that show turf route speed turning back in distance because she has done her best running on the front end. They're putting the blinkers on, which sort of suggests that they want her to be forward once again, but she's got a pretty fast horse drawn to her inside in the number 3 Gunboat, who the one time that, or the time that she sprinted on turf and broke her maiden, she set some pretty honest fractions, so she just feels like a naturally faster horse, and I wonder if Diamond Hands might not be able to make the lead here. That could spell trouble for her. So I agree with you. She's one that I wanted to downgrade at what could be a short price. Got a couple runners coming out of an N1X race that was run at Aqueduct in April, going out for strong connections. The number 10, Gallina Rush, who just lost by a nose. The number 7, Anna Karenine, who was third in that race. Had a trouble comment there, but it was very minor trouble. She was just taken up at the very end of that race when it was basically all but decided. So I'm not going to really put too much stock in that. Gallina Rush, Craig, definitely a contender in this race, but she can be fairly pace dependent.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of those two are logical horses. They can't blame anybody for using. Of the two, I would actually prefer the 7 horse Anna Karenine. I thought maybe she moved a little bit too early into what was a really solid pace and hung a little bit late. And I thought maybe Gallon or Russ was flattered a bit by that pace situation that day. So yeah, of the two, I would definitely use both of these in a pick five. I think either one can win, and it wouldn't be a big surprise. But I would prefer the 7. You already mentioned the AE, so I think if she draws in, she would probably be my top pick in here. I really liked her race last time. And as you said, it's only going to take one horse, so she would be a play for me. The other one I'm interested in is that speed horse you talked about, Gunboat, who's coming in off over a year layoff. But she showed some real talent, and I'm not sure there's a whole lot of other speed in here. So she's one I think could be dangerous. I don't want to knock her speed figures too much. They maybe look a little bit light compared to some others, but most of those came as a 2 year old when she was doing her best running. And Shug McGay, he can get him ready. If you look at the workout, she's been working out pretty steady all the way back to February, almost a workout every week, some good ones. So I expect her to be ready to run.
Yeah, I think Gunboat's a contender in this race for me as well. Don't always love Eric Cancel on a speed horse, especially drawn the inside. He's going to have to be aggressive because I don't think this is a filly that wants to pass any horses. She needs to lead gate to wire if she's going to be successful here, but she does seem like the most naturally quick of the runners that are entered in here. Just a matter of whether or not she's going to be ready off that lengthy layoff. Craig, a horse that I do want to ask you about that I kind of had a tough time making up my mind about, and I ultimately sort of went in the negative direction, is the plain one Redefined, who is part of an entry, but her entry mate is drawn too deep on the also eligible list, so she's likely to be the only one that participates. If Redefined were just coming in off her 2-year-old form, you'd project some improvement and probably view her as the horse to beat in this race, but what happened last time at Tampa when she was 2-5, justifiably so, and just completely failed to show up?
This one for me will depend on the board and what it's telling me. And it's one I'd actually want to see her taking some action more than your morning line. I tend to give fillies a little bit more of an excuse for total clunkers. Just been my experience that they rebound from those a lot better than male horses tend to do. I have no explanation for that last race. She was 2-5. She was made a mild move in a race that was pretty weak. Didn't hasn't come back strong after the fact. It didn't look all that strong before. She was 2-5 for a reason. I don't want to totally dismiss her, but I'm glad it's the first leg because if she's cold on the board, I wouldn't want any parts of her.
Yeah, I mean, originally I was leaning towards giving her a pass for that race, but then I went back and watched the Stewart Manor as well, and it wasn't as pronounced, but she sort of did the exact same thing. I mean, she was a heavy favorite in that race, and she ranged up at the 8th pole like you'd have taken 1 to 100 that she was going to run by Moon Age Daydream, and she didn't only not go by that horse, she just hit the brakes and actually completely shut down across the finish line and almost got passed for second. And when you watch her last race, it was even a more pronounced version of that, because she ranged up at the top of the stretch like she was just going to blow by that field to Tampa, and as soon as she got into the straightaway, it's like she just hit a wall and shortened stride, completely shut down. It feels like there's an issue with this horse. I don't know if it's a breathing issue or a bleeding issue, but something is preventing her from finishing off her races. She's had some time off since then, so maybe Tony Dutcher has figured out what was ailing her. But I find her tough to trust in here, and I agree. I would not want to take any kind of short price on her. I do want to mention at least one bigger price in here, Craig, that I'm very intrigued by, and that is the other Christophe Clement trainee. He obviously has Gallina Rush, who is a contender in this race, but the number 9, Michelle M., I think is a new face that I want to consider here. I know she looks way too slow on speed figures, but both of those races last year were as a 2-year-old, so maybe she's going to be capable of better coming back for her 3-year-old campaign. And also, those were both races on synthetic, and I don't want to be too hard on horses that are turf meant, who maybe don't run as well as you might expect on synthetic, because it's not always a given that synthetic form is just going to naturally translate to turf and back and forth. Some horses are just turf specialists, and this horse has such a turf pedigree on the dam side. I know she's by West Coast, who you wouldn't really think of as a turf sire, but if you look up the stats or his best progeny, he's actually had most of his success so far as a turf sire. And on the dam side, this is a strong female turf family. The second dam, DR, was a really good turf producer from a strong family, the John Chandler bred horses. The dam's a half to Wilcox Inn, who won over $1 million, was primarily a turf horse. So I really like this horse getting on the turf. Who knows how good she is? It's really hard to tell based on the races last year, but Christophe Clement did not have to run her on this circuit, coming into his barn for the first time. He could have tried to pick an easier spot or gone to Monmouth, but the fact that he's running in this race and the fact that she has his go-to rider, Joel Rosario, on her, to me, some good signs here for a horse that is going to be a really big price. So just one that I wanted to give some consideration to in a race where I found little faults with all of the favorites. So it's a race where I do want to keep an open mind with regard to some prices.
Yeah, I have no problem with her. She will be on my tickets if I play a pick 5. I mean, for one, it's a turf sprint with Christophe Clement and Joel Rosario. Even if you didn't know anything about the horse, you know they're probably going to be kind of dangerous because they both excel in these spots. And all the things you say are true. I think we've probably talked about it before, but I think you make a really good point about synthetics. It truly is a third surface. And especially now that most of the synthetics are all the same, that basically all of them are the Capetta surface. And she's a horse who knows if she's a turf horse. We've seen plenty of horses who run on synthetic and do well, and they run well on dirt and can't run on turf. So I just never want to make that assumption that just because a horse runs a certain way on synthetic, it's going to carry over to the turf.
Let's move on to the next leg of this Pick 5 sequence. We'll stay on the turf, but move over to the Widener course for this maiden special weight event going 1 mile and a 16th. We have 3-year-olds and up horses, though I think this field is comprised of only 3-year-olds going this route distance. And Craig, I think there are some nice, or I should say, some potentially nice runners in this field. They all have to do to prove that they can run to their pedigrees or improve on the nice performances that they've put forth so far in their short careers. I think the number 2, Cumberland, probably will go favorite here, I guess, depending on how much money the Chad Brown first-time starter takes. And just on the surface of things, Cumberland, has some strong form lines. Just looking at his last race, he was barely run down by Kalick, who we'll get to the Pennine Ridge in just a bit, but he's one of the top contenders in that race. So seems like he's coming out of a really strong race where the two of them finished over 6 lengths clear of the rest of the field. So Cumberland definitely showed some good form last time. One thing I will say about him, Craig, that just gives me some cause for pause is I think this is the third time that he's been entered recently. Both races that he was entered in so far at the Belmont meet were rained off the turf, and I didn't look it up. I'm just going off memory, but I believe those races were at 6 furlongs and 7 furlongs, and now they're entering him in a mile in the 16th race. So it feels like there was some intention to turn this horse back in distance, and probably just out of some frustration, they're running him in the race that came up, which is a turf route. So I do have a few concerns about the distance, but this horse has quality.
This was a race that where when I first saw the sequence, I was really hoping I could narrow it down, and it turns out it's not that way because there's a lot of horses who could win. And in a spot like that, I don't really want to go with a horse like Cumberland, too. I think he had every reason not to get run. Yes, Calic, the horse he beat him, is turned out next time and ran a really strong race. I don't put a whole lot of stock in the fact it was a big gap back to third because if you look through the Timeform US chart, none of the horses in behind have done anything, and several of them have come back to run. So I think it was just basically a two-horse race, and I don't want to assume that just because Calic took a step forward, that Cumberland's going to take a step forward, particularly when he blew an easy lead going along a mile, and now he's trying to go longer. And you telling me that he's been entered in some sprints gives me pause as well. So I'm going to look for some others to try to beat Cumberland too. I agree with you. Is probably going to be a short price, but in my opinion, contention runs pretty deep in here.
Yeah, and I think we do have to next talk about the Chad Brown first time starter in this race, the number 8 redistricting, who just feels like one that might be pretty live with Irad Ortiz on board. This horse was purchased overseas at the Tattersall sale as a yearling. He's by Kingman, who has been one of the top sires in the world for the past several years. And Chad Brown has had some good Kingmans in his barn. And this horse also has big pedigree. The Dam is a full sister to St. Nicholas Abbey, that Breeders' Cup Turf winner. So this one's bred to be a good horse, Greg. We know that Chad Brown can win with a first-time starter. And speaking of Kalick, who beat Cumberland last time, when I was looking up the workouts for redistricting, his last workout matches Kalick, so it feels like these two worked in company on May 27th, so maybe a sign of some confidence that this horse has ability.
Yeah, and we know this is a Corvette stable horse. He wins a lot. When I looked up in Formulator, I think turf routes first time out with this owner is 24% or something like that. So there's a very strong chance this horse is going to win. Now, you don't get rewarded at the windows because they're always going to take money. Now, maybe a horse like Cumberland is going to help that a little bit, as he probably won't go favored. But I think he's a horse that if you're playing to pick five, you almost have to have on your tickets. I can't think of a reason you wouldn't want to use them.
As you were alluding to, Craig, there are other options to consider in this race, actually quite a few of them, as this is a pretty competitive maiden event. Who else were you looking at in here?
I actually was, there's a few of them. I'll start with the four Baltazar, a horse that comes in for Neil Drysdale. He's been knocking at the door his last few times out, and I kind of like this last race at Keeneland where there wasn't a whole lot of pace. We actually gave this race a really big pace upgrade, but he was making up some real ground at the end. I thought it was a strong race, and maybe the slow time will have some people doubting that one, but I think he's got a shot in here. The five, Pavon for Jorge Abreu is he's a guy who's really solid with first time starters. And when I narrowed it down to just on the turf routing, it was still fine. A good ORI, not quite the win percentage of a Chad Brown, but solid nonetheless. So that's a couple of them right there. And I want to say there was one more. Oh, the seven horse. Fly Right is a horse who comes in with really good speed figure, particularly last out that he earned as a 2 year old. And that's a race he comes out of that has proven to be really strong when you look through the chart. Lots of good performances out of that race from the other horses in the race, kind of verifying that speed figure. It's just a matter of if you think he can come back well from a 7 month layoff for a little bit lesser known trainer who doesn't win very often. But I do think this horse has some talent.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned three horses that are interesting in here and didn't even touch upon the horse that I put on top. So it's that kind of race. It's very competitive. I'll just kind of go in reverse order to comment on some of the horses that you mentioned. Yeah, that number 7 Fly Right, he ran some good races as a 2-year-old. His debut was particularly strong when he hit the wire with General Jim, who has gone on to do some nice things. And, they probably got a little too ambitious trying the Pilgrim as a maiden, and he got very rank in the early stages of that race and basically was completely finished after he was fighting his rider by the halfway point. And then last time out, good field, like you said. I mean, the winner, Ari Gold, turned into a good horse. I guess he's since gone to the sidelines because we haven't seen him since the middle of winter. But the thing with Fly Right is that I didn't love the way he finished off his last race. He was in the mix until the stretch. It's not like the pace was that fast. I mean, it was on the honest side, and he was chasing it, but the winner was up front throughout, so it held together, and he just really was shortening stride at the end of that race. And I look at the pedigree, and I believe he is I forget if he's a half or a full. I think he is a full brother, yes, to Sail By, who raced for these same connections, and she was a good stakes horse, but I always preferred her going distances of a mile or less, so I feel like maybe a mile and a 16th is just a little far for Fly Right, and I want to see him turn back in distance. No argument with Balthazar. I think he is a legitimate contender in this race for Neil Drysdale. I agree about that race that he's coming out of at Keeneland and Pavon. I mean, he's a wild card, as you said. Jorge Abreu can be dangerous. I'm interested in the number 6, Ohana Honor, who got on the turf for the first time last time out, and certainly has some turf pedigree. He's got actually a really versatile pedigree, being by Honor Code, who I think is a sneaky good turf influence. And on the dam side, she's produced a very good horse for Christophe Clement, Space something. His name is escaping me now. But Ohana Honor tried the turf last time out at Aqueduct, and I just didn't think he got the most comfortable trip that day. He did save ground early, but there was a point in mid-stretch where the winner was revving up on the far outside, and he just sort of had to wait behind horses and finally found a seam to run through at about the 8th pole, but he was only hitting his best stride just as they came onto the wire, and then he galloped out strongly. It just feels like we didn't see the best effort from him last time, but I did think he was striding over the turf well, handled it well, and a little bit of extra ground is probably going to suit this horse, and I just think there's a step forward in him. He's also getting a big rider upgrade to Flavian Pratt, and I don't think he's going to be among the favorites in this race. So I was pretty interested in him. Though I will say, Craig, I'll be interested to see how this pace shakes out, because we've knocked some of these horses like Cumberland, but if he gets loose on the lead, that makes him dangerous. It's just always hard to read the pace situations in these maiden races.
Yeah, I'm with you though. I think Fly Right is pretty headstrong, and that's why he wouldn't be one of my top picks in here. And I actually wasn't done. I like your horse Ohana Honor quite a bit. He's got one of the more interesting in Timeform US when you click on his pedigree and look through the siblings. I'm not quite sure I've ever seen a horse like this where he has 5 siblings listed, and every one of them has a top Timeform US speed figure of 115 or higher. And they're all, I think they're all on the turf as well. So it's pretty crazy. And I'm with you. He comes out of the same race that the 3 horse when Love Takes Over was in. He actually finished ahead of Ohana Honor, but I prefer Ohana Honor in here. And he's one I would probably use as an A along with redistricting. If I narrowed this down to just 2 horses, I would use some others, but those 2 would be my main focus.
Yeah, no, it's amazing, that dam of Ohana Honor, Spacey Tracy. She has been quite a producer. I remember, but I forget, I think I was writing the closer look about this horse when he debuted. And it's just kind of amazing to look through her production. Space Launch was the horse I was trying to think of, who is a turf horse, even though he's by Bernardini. So there's definitely some turf pedigree there, but she's also produced dirt stakes winners like Victim of Love and High Benner Island, who was a good 3-year-old sprinter. So yeah, definitely a lot of versatility and class from that dam. So an interesting 7th race to be sure. And things have not been easy through these first 2 legs of the pick 5 sequence. They might get a little bit easier to narrow down in the 8th race, Craig, as we move on and turn the page to the next leg. This is a New York bred allowance race, N1X affair, going a mile and a 16th on the dirt. And I do think we're going to have a clear favorite in this race in the number 7 Shadow Dragon, who they got pretty ambitious with. They tried a series of Derby preps. He ran in the Fountain of Youth and the Wood Memorial, actually was second in the Holy Bull, going all the way back to the beginning of the season. Just wasn't good enough to really contend in those races as they continued to get tougher along the Derby Trail. And I think they're doing the right thing, setting their sights a little bit lower, taking advantage of his New York bred status to run in this N1X allowance race. But when you compare him to some others based on speed figures, it's not like he's got that big of an advantage.
No, he doesn't. This is a race, I think, which one of the things I have to consider is the pace. And we have it labeled as a race with a fast pace. I agree with it. It looks like there's quite a bit of speed in here. And that would help Shadow Dragon if this race holds together as it's drawn, because there's several horses with speed. There's a couple with similar speed figures drawn to the inside who, if it does hold together, I don't particularly care for, in the one Cephalo's Mission and the 242 Ace. So this is the one race where I'm going to try to narrow it down. And again, I kind of give that the caveat that the race needs to stay together and keep that fast-paced designation. One of them would obviously be Shadow Dragon. Even though his speed figures look similar, the last couple were in races where he wasn't being persevered with at the end. He was way over his head. It's sometimes a little question if horses can regain their form when they move back in class, but this is such a big drop. I don't think it's going to be an issue for him. But I am interested in one other horse, and that's the 3-horse Inspector, who's going to be a much bigger price. He comes in with a lower speed figure. He raced, I assume, as a first time gelding last time. It's always hard to say. Maybe he was a second time gelding, but he was coming off a layoff, so I tend to think it was probably before the last race. He was put up via DQ, and this was a horse who had some real trouble. So I'm not holding that speed figure against him. First, he was wide around the turn, lost quite a bit of ground that way. And then the horse who was eventually DQ'd actually came into him pretty good and really impacted his momentum. And I think that has to be worth at least 4 or 5 points on the speed figure scale, which would put him right there. So, given the likely pace scenario, I won't be surprised if he gets a first jump on Shadow Dragon. Uh, he won't be on the pace, but he'd be more likely to be mid pack, and I think it will come down to those two.
Yeah, he's definitely going to be a price in this race because, like you said, I mean, the speed figures just don't really point him out as one of the contenders in here. And also, he's never crossed the wire first, which some people might hold against him. He is a horse that I know they liked a lot at the beginning of his career. He actually took a lot of money in his first 2 starts and just wasn't really putting it together. And maybe it was the gelding that woke him up last time. Also, a little extra distance seemed to suit him because he did finally show up and run a complete race last time, just like you said. Got hindered at the very end of that race. It was going to be close, I think, between the winner who got taken down and him. If not for that trouble, I don't think he was going to win by 2 lengths or anything. It was probably going to be a photo finish. So I understand why he was put up via DQ. I don't love that race overall from a quality standpoint, but at least he's moving in the right direction. He's one that was considered to have potential at one point. I kind of like a similar, or a horse with a similar profile in this race, just one that seems to have some upside off a maiden win, and that's the number 6 Ormstown, who probably is not going to be as big of a price, but I just really liked his maiden breaking score last time. He is a horse that just seemed like he was still figuring things out in the first 2 starts of his career, chased a fast pace on debut, and then got a weird ride second time out where he was sort of jammed inside and really nowhere to go and shuffled back at some key points. They stretched him out for the first time last time. He showed improved speed, got to the front end, and just looked like a completely different horse, traveling much more freely, and he drew away under wraps. That was a really impressive victory, and he beat some horses who had previously run some nice speed figures, so that 100 TimeformUS number, it's totally legit. I mean, arguably that race might have been even stronger. So I think this is a good horse. We'll see if he can be as effective changing his running style back to coming from off the pace here, because that's my one concern, Craig. I do think he's going to have to pass some horses. He's not going to get to the front in here with runners like 42 Ace or even the long shot Hurricane Andrew, who his only hope in this race is to go forward. So I feel like Ormstown does have to prove he has that extra dimension, but I think the talent is there for him to compete with a horse like Shadow Dragon.
Yeah, and the good thing is, obviously, a mile and a 16th at Belmont's a one-turn race, so he's going to be outside the other speed horses, and maybe that would help him kind of revert to that more off-the-pace running style, which he used unsuccessfully the first couple times. So he would have been my second horse if not for the pace scenario. If some of the others' horses scratch, he would probably default to that situation. I would still use Shadow Dragon just because I think he's going to run a much better speed figure than we've seen from him in the past, and the others are going to have to step up. But yeah, I have no problem with Ormstown as well.
Yeah, and I agree with you on Sapphilo's Mission and 42 Ace, who you were referring to. I'm not sure at a distance really helps Sapphilo's Mission as they continue to stretch him out, and 42 Ace just beat weaker horses last time. They're just not runners for me in a spot like this, and I'd much rather go to those with upside. And, I might have been a little negative on Shadow Dragon earlier, but I mean, I do consider him the horse to beat in this race. Like you said, the pace scenario is supposed to work for him, and class relief generally works wonders for a horse like this. I just don't expect there to be much price or value with him. Let's move on to the feature race in this Pick 5 sequence, the feature race on Saturday at Belmont Park, the Grade 2 Pennine Ridge. Craig and I also did a stakes preview on this race that you can check out on Daily Racing Form's YouTube channel, where we went in depth on every one of the contenders, probably spending more time than we'll do as we go through it for this Pick 5 purposes. I will note, as I did there, that the number 2 Sherrar is expected to scratch from this race. He was cross-entered in a stakes at Churchill Downs on Saturday, and they're going to run there instead, so that reduces this to a field of 7, but it doesn't really change the pace scenario, Craig, as it just doesn't feel like there's very much front-running speed signed on outside of the number 6 Kalik, who tried out front-running tactics last time out in that allowance race at Belmont Park, ran away from that field very impressively, and if they use the same kind of running style here, which I think they'd be foolish not to, he's just going to be loose on the lead and maybe really tough to beat.
Yeah, I mentioned on our preview, I'm not sure why this race doesn't have the favors early label. As I look at the preview page, it really is baffling. So I'm going to have to write our tech guys and find out what happened here because I'm 99.9% sure that it should. Kalik is a horse who really improved last time out. We talked about him briefly earlier in the maiden race, but he exploded last time in the stretch using front running tactics for the first time. And I think he's going to get a similar scenario this time to what he got last time, where not only is he going to be on the lead, he's going to be doing it set in slow fractions or, in TimeformUS blue fractions. And they're going to have to catch him in the stretch. And if he finishes off the way he did last time, it's going to take a really big effort from some of the others in here. Now, granted, there's some horses with some real credentials in here, in Farbridge and Silver Knot especially, but maybe a couple others as well. But they're going to have their work cut out for them if the pace develops like it looks like it should on paper.
I agree. It feels like Kalik is really just coming along at the right time for a very dangerous barn. And just given the way this race shapes up, I almost view him as the horse to beat in this race. And, I pegged him at 7-2 on the morning line, and I'll be interested to see how they bet this race. With Irad Ortiz Day and given that obvious pace advantage, it's hard to see him going favored in here, just given the strength of some of the competition. But I won't be surprised when he gets bet down a little bit, just because it feels like there are so many arrows pointing to this horse, and he has that talent anyway outside of those advantages. So I think he's a really strong contender. But Craig, we should touch upon the two horses that I think will vie for favoritism in Silver Knot and Farbridge. Farbridge is obviously a really good horse. I mean, he's yet to run a bad race in 3 starts. He's just a runner that doesn't possess that much early speed, and he's also a horse that's gotten pretty good trips in his races, generally saving ground every time, coming up the rail, getting that seam to run through, and sometimes in a slow-paced race where the field is really bunched and when the horse is drawn on the outside, it can be tough to work out that same kind of trip.
For sure, he's a horse who's hasn't shown much early speed, even all the way back to his maiden win when he beat the pretty highly regarded Carl Spackler that day. He's had fast paces in his last 2 good ground saving trips. He's ran very nice speed figures, and I agree with you. I think he'll probably go favored, but the one concern for me would be that pace scenario and the fact that, as you said, without a lot of pace in here, there's a pretty good chance he's not going to be able to go to the rail and save ground. If he does, it means he's probably going to be dropping back to last, which wouldn't be a very good position.
Yeah, I prefer the other short price, the number 4 Silver Knot, who I made my top pick in this race, and I think 2 to 1 is probably a decent price on him. Just given the talent that I think he possesses, and I'll be very interested to see how he breaks in this race because I think the start is really going to be key for him, as it often is for these horses coming over from Europe, where an alert beginning is often not as much a priority as it is in the United States. And he did not break that sharply when he ran in that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf last year. Still ran well in that race and kind of amazingly found a spot to squeeze through on the rail at the 8th pole to make that late run to just miss that day. But Craig, that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf, I maintain that is a much stronger race than I thought it was at the time. And, sometimes horses just get better over time, but the number of horses that have come back out of that Breeders' Cups and subsequently improved their speed figures just say to me that maybe that race was a lot stronger than the speed figure that we gave it back then. We haven't seen the winner, Victoria Road, come back. I don't think he's even run in Europe yet this year. But there were some really nice horses in that race. I mean, Nagarok, I think he just ran a speed figure near 120. Mustache has run some big speed figures. Major Dude was in that race. I mean, the list goes on. I even think Webslinger was in there, who won the American Turf. So, I mean, there were really good horses in that race last year, and Silver Knot easily finished ahead of them. Obviously, he didn't show up off the layoff in the 2000 Guineas. That just was an ambitious spot. And also, the boggy turf course just did not play to his strengths. That's not the kind of going that he prefers. I think this is the right race for him, and I like the added distance for him based on pedigree. There's a lot of stamina breeding on the bottom side of his pedigree. So I think he makes a lot of sense here. I just think he has to break sharply so that he can get into some sort of forward position because I wouldn't want to see him out the back door in this race.
Yeah, as to the speed figure, I have no real argument with that. It does seem like it's a stronger race. These races are tough when all the Europeans dominate, which we saw in the turf races on Breeders' Cup 2-year-old day, where the filly and mare race was won by the same. And the speed figure for the filly and mare race has kind of held up. We haven't really had any strong performances, so it's one of those. Maybe it's just the horses ran to the wire, not to run a fast time that day. It's just hard to explain, but I have no knocks on Silver Knot other than the price. Um, I certainly wouldn't not use him in a pick five if I was playing because I think he's got a good chance to win. I'm going to narrow it down to just the 3 horses, even though I think there's probably some others that can win, but you can only use so many in here. Like you, I'm dismissing the last race, especially given that boggy course. It was much better horses. So I think you can put a line through that one, but he does have a shot for sure. I mean, it's just a matter of the price. And I did want to mention we've seen Charlie Appleby this year. I know he won a ton of races the last few years, but he's lost a couple races this year at very short prices, including one with Modern Games. So not sure if that's a trend. I tend to doubt it. I mean, it's not like those horses ran terrible in defeat, but it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, he's had 4 starters so far this year in the U.S., and just one of them won. Modern Games ran fine. The big disappointment was that horse that finished off the board of the Man of War, who was crazily bet down to 3 to 5 odds. And I'm hoping that maybe that performance, when they went so overboard, scares off some bettors a little bit, and maybe they don't go as crazy for Silver Knot, but we'll see how that plays out with regard to the prices. I do want to mention the number 1, Lachey's, who I was trying to build a case for to use prominently in this race, and I almost got there. I couldn't quite get there. I'll probably still use him as a backup, just given the fact that he's going to be such a big price. But I thought this horse showed some potential last year as a 2-year-old. I thought he ran pretty well in that Pilgrim after being green on debut. He was really wide into the stretch and was really motoring down the outside in a race where nobody else was making up that kind of ground at the end. So I think this horse might have a step forward in him. It's just a really tough spot off the layoff, and as I've highlighted in the past, I think on this podcast or maybe on one of our stakes previews, Jorge Abreu is a trainer that has just not had any success in graded stakes races. Literally, he's 0 for 57 in graded stakes. So some knocks against that horse, but he'll be a pretty big price in here. So one that I could include somewhere.
Yeah, I could see using him in verticals. I actually was like you. I wanted to make a case for him. But speed figure wise, I know he hasn't run since October of his 2-year-old season, but it still seems like a pretty hefty jump. And it's not just that he would need the speed figure jump, it's a pretty big jump in class, despite both races being grade 2s. I'm not sure that the Pilgrim really was outside of the winner, who's pretty good, but the rest of the field, So yeah, I won't be surprised if he wins, but just too many. I mean, if I won't be surprised if he runs well. I would be surprised if he wins. One other horse I wanted to mention was the three horse Bellouni, I guess is how you say it. Chad Brown's other horse in here, and he's one that I think's actually probably better than his speed figures indicate. He's been in races with no pace two times in a row. This might still be a little bit of a jump up in class, though. Not really for me, but just wanted to mention him that I do think he'll run better than that 104 we saw last time. It's just still a pretty big leap to get up into the to mid-teens that some others have run.
Yeah, I just think this is a really tough division, and the top of this division, which I do believe Silver Knot and Far Bridge are at, and Kalik is right there. I think it's going to be tough to break into for a horse like Ballooney, who I think is coming out of a really weak race in the Woodhaven. So I think he's going to have to take a big step forward. But for a Chad Brown runner, he'll probably be a nice price in this race. Let's close out this sequence by looking at race 10. It is a New York bred maiden claiming event, $40,000 tag for the 3 and up runners going a mile and a 16th on the Widener turf course. Got a full field signed on, Craig. Oversubscribed, actually, and you do want to note that because the horse that I would have made the morning line favorite, and I actually did make the morning line favorite, is the number 14, Miracle Mike, who would take a lot of money if he drew in here, going out for Todd Pletcher and Irad Ortiz, having run well last time in his turf debut, but he needs a couple scratches to get in, so let's assume that he's not in the race for now, and among the main body of this field, it's a real skullbuster. It's just totally wide open, horses that don't have a lot of great turf form, some dropping in class. It's hard to know where to begin.
This makes me miss those Arkansas bred maiden claimers we were doing back in the early winter time when we did a few from Oaklawn, because I think they were a little bit easier than this race. I started out handicapping this race and I was tossing horses out as I went through the field, thinking of all the things that I didn't particularly like. And as I got toward the bottom of the field, I had to go back and put a couple of them in because it was just hard for me to really latch on to anybody in here. I'll give an example. I started when I saw Barry the Builder. He was a horse I said, I don't want any parts of this horse. He backs up in the stretch every single time. Um, I don't, he hasn't hit the board in a long time. It's just, he doesn't run like a turf horse. And I still don't really like him in here, to be honest. But when I looked at the rest of the field, it was just hard to dismiss him because there's not a whole bunch of horses in here that look all that great. The same with the one horse, Harry, who is a first time starter for Bill Mott. Not exactly his strength, debuting in a maiden turf route, maiden claiming turf route. And I was like, well, I don't want any parts of that. But as I got through the field, I was like, I may have to use this horse. But to be honest, the more I went through this race, it kind of determined for me that it's highly unlikely that I would be playing a pick five on Saturday because I'm already pretty wide in some of the other races, and this one was just a real skull buster. The one horse that I looked through and I was like, is going to take some money, and I would confidently toss, and that doesn't mean he can't win. I just don't want any parts of it. Is the 12 horse Bad Larry, who you had pegged at 4-1 on the morning line. And when I looked up Mike Maker's stats on Formulator for first off the claim, first time on the turf, they were just terrible. I think it was something like 1 for 26, and the horse who won paid just like 4-1 or something. So the ROI is obviously very, very bad. So of all the horses in the field, this was the one I actually had an opinion about.
Well, Craig, I'll say that the two horses that sort of jumped out at you as being the two tosses, even though you sort of backtracked on one of them, I kind of think are the two horses to beat in this race. I mean, it's just not, it's just not a strong field, and a horse like Barry the Builder, who I know you sort of came around on, I do kind of view him as one that you have to use because he was involved in a pretty fast pace last time. That was a race where a horse ran off on the front end, and he actually moved after that horse in the first 3/8 of a mile, and you can kind of see it in the published running line. He made up 6 lengths after the first call to contest that fast pace, and then it completely fell apart at the end. So I can kind of forgive him for losing ground at the end of that race, and I mean, he ran some races last year on the turf that were all when he was a 2-year-old. They're just okay, and it feels like he fits at this level based on the last race. So I kind of view Barry the Builder as the horse to beat in here. I don't have a clever take on trying to beat him. And as for Bad Larry, I hear you. I mean, I looked at that stat as well, and you would expect it to be better than it is because Mike Maker has such a reputation for doing well, getting horses to excel on the turf, but it hasn't played out that way with the claims. I will say, watching this horse's races and watching him run, I do think he's a turf horse. His last race, it was just watching the early part of it. He was getting so far back because he was really reacting badly to the kickback. You could just see he looked really uncomfortable towards the back of the pack, and Trevor McCarthy had to swing him to the far outside out of the kickback to get him to do some running, but he lost a lot of ground in doing so, and he was really moving past horses quickly at the end of that race, and he's got this action that says to me turf is not going to be a problem, and there's plenty of turf pedigree on the dam side. The dam won on turf. He's a half to a turf winner, and I've really liked what I've seen from the Collecteds, his sire Collected so far on the turf, 10 for 78 so far with the progeny starting on the turf. So I just think Bad Larry makes a lot of sense in here, but it's not like he's going to be some clever big price because I think I'm pointing out a lot of obvious stuff, and he's a sexy new face, if you could even say that about him, in a race where a lot of the other horses are just sort of uninspiring. So, I mean, I didn't want to make him my top pick in here, but I think he's one that I would use. Some others just don't do a whole lot for me. I mean, there are some class droppers like Atlantis Acuna and The Thrill of Victory, but they're just horses that I haven't seen do a whole lot of running. I mean, Atlantis Acuna did achieve a decent turf result back when he closed out his 2-year-old campaign, getting on the turf for the first time, but he got such a favorable setup that day, slow pace. He was riding an advantageous rail path around the track. To me, that performance was a little bit phony, and then he came back last time and just didn't do any running. I went for sort of a crazy horse in this race that I just am sort of married to giving one more shot to, and that's the number 6, Just for Luck, who looks uncompetitive based on speed figures. I get that, or at least his last 2, but he was in that same race, which I think was a lot tougher than this one, that maiden special weight, won by It's All Coming Together, and he didn't finish that far behind Atlantis Acuna and The Thrill of Victory, and he was just badly outrun in the early stages, just looked kind of sluggish. It was the exact same thing in his prior start at Gulfstream, when he just really never got out of a common gallop, but this horse did show something in his debut at Keeneland when he got off to a comically bad start. I mean, he hesitated and shied and was just way behind the field early, but he was really running in the stretch of that race. I mean, the jockey got into him and he was really finishing at the end against a much better field than this, and I don't know what's happened in the last 2 races that he's just completely fallen apart, but now he's getting another trainer switch, moving into Ray Handel's barn, and Ray Handel, I think, has been doing a fantastic job with all kinds of runners over the past year and a half or so. They're putting the blinkers on, maybe the kind of focus this horse needs. He's going to be a price in here, and I liked him last time and was disappointed, but this is a much easier spot, and I just think I have to give him one more chance because I don't think anybody in this race looks that formidable.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think you'll get every bit of that 12-1 that he is on the morning line. So no problem with him. There's nothing wrong with Crazy in this race. The only other horse I wanted to mention, not that he's a big price, is the 3 War Prince. He tried turf last time for the first time as a gelding, and I thought he ran a solid enough race. He finished just behind Miracle Mike, who you mentioned, if he is able to draw in, would probably go favored in here. So I didn't want to totally dismiss War Prince with any improvement. His speed figures are just as good as anybody else.
Yeah, and I should just note, I kind of hope Miracle Mike does draw in because I would not like him in this race if he were in the race. I think he would go favored, but I thought that Barry the Builder especially, and even War Prince, ran a better race than Miracle Mike did last time because Miracle Mike got to take advantage of that fast pace that fell apart, whereas Barry the Builder sort of made the move to break that race open. So I would actually prefer the 2 that I think are going to be bigger prices if he were in the race. I just doubt that he could get the scratches to draw in, but something I wanted to note. And, Craig, you mentioned the first-time starter, the number 1, Hari, and I understand. I mean, you want to find some sort of new face in this race because those that we've seen on the turf just haven't really done that much. Bill, like you alluded to this a little bit, but I'll just kind of read off the stats. Belmont does not debut live horses in maiden claiming races, or he just hasn't recently. Overall, in maiden claiming races on debut over the past 5 years, he's 0 for 13 with just one hitting the board, 0 for 7 on the turf. So I have some reservations about that horse being very much, but look, a horse isn't going to have to be that much to be successful in here, so definitely a tough way to close out this sequence. So, Craig, I get the sense that you're not interested in putting together a ticket for this one, but let's just say hypothetically, if you were, I mean, who are some of the horses you might lean on throughout? I get the sense there aren't that many of them, or maybe alternatively, if you're really not interested in playing the pick five, as we went through these races, are there any horses that you think would be, solid win bets? Because you don't have to play the pick five, as we've said many times before, and spend some time discussing on last week's podcast. Maybe you just want to approach some of these races differently because there are certainly some appealing things going on in a few of these races.
Yeah, there's definitely some races I want to play vertically. In the first race, I think Gunboat at anywhere near that 5-1 odds in the morning line would be worth a shot. She's going to be probably on the front end. And I wasn't all that impressed with some others in here. So in race 7, I do want to take a shot against Cumberland. I do think some others will take a lot of the money, so I'm not all that interested in them. But I think a horse like Balthazar could be worth a bet. He's one, if he's around the morning line, I would consider him. And I want to say there was one other now the 6 horse who you mentioned, Ohana Honor. I thought his last race was good, and given that family and what prodigy have done out of that mare, I think he's a horse who could slip through the cracks at a nice price. In race 8, I'm interested in Inspector if the race holds together, and we expect that fast pace like we're showing now. So I will definitely be playing him and playing Exactas with Shadow Dragon. If for some reason it looked like some of the speed scratched out, I'd have no problem switching to your horse Ormstown. In the Pennine Ridge, I'm really interested in Cowlick. I just think he has too big of a speed advantage, and I think the price might hold given the reputation of Farbridge and Silver Knot, who obviously comes out of that Breeders' Cup race, so he's going to have the name. And in the 10th race, I'll probably have the TV turned off by then.
Understandable. I probably will entertain putting a ticket together for this pick 5 sequence, and if I do so, my strategy would be to narrow things down in a few of these really difficult legs, particularly the 6th race, the first leg of the sequence. There are just a lot of horses in here that I think are going to offer negative value that I'm not that interested in, so I would tend to want to go thin in a race like this where I expect a lot of people to spread. Sometimes that can be your edge in a sequence like this, and I think that not the number 9 Michelle M is very interesting. I'm using that horse. I agree about the number 3 Gunboat. Among the main body of the field, they're the two that I would key on. I would use the number 11 Cadencia if she draws in, but I want to try to keep this race a little more simple than some other people might in this sequence. In the 7th race, I did make Ohana Honor my top pick. I wouldn't want to single him or anything or lean too heavily on him. I just think he's an interesting value horse in this race. The number 8 redistricting definitely scares me. I'd be tempted to take a shot against Cumberland and maybe leave him off my tickets in favor of horses like Balthazar or potentially even that first-time starter Pavon. So if I use multiple horses in this race, it probably will not, or I should say Cumberland will not be among them. In the 8th race, I would just use 2, Ormstown and Shadow Dragon, and try to advance through the race with them. I think that they are the 3-year-olds with some upside, and I think that they just might have a talent edge on this field. And then in the Pennine Ridge, again, I would try to narrow it down to just 2. Silver Knot and Kalik would be the 2 for me. I'm probably pressing Silver Knot a little bit more. Just given the way this race shapes up, I'd probably lean against using Farbridge and try to beat him. And maybe I could convince myself to use the number 1 Lachey's as a distant backup, like a C type, an ABC type wager, because I do think he's going to be a nice price in this race, though I don't think he's that likely to win. Just one of the few horses that is going to slip through the cracks that I can get interested in the Pennine Ridge. And then to close things out, I'll primarily use 3 horses. Barry the Builder, Just for Luck, who is my top pick and I think is going to offer the best value, and then the number 12, Bad Larry. Not thrilled about the value on that one, but I just think he makes enough sense in this race. But probably do prefer Barry the Builder and Just for Luck a little bit from a value standpoint. But it's not easy, Craig. You're going to have to be right a few times in this sequence to hit.
Yeah, it's a good sequence, not necessarily for me as a pick 5, but I joked in the beginning that we were going to, that it was such a tough sequence and what are you doing to me? But I actually really liked it. It's just I will play it more from a vertical standpoint. Um, I think next week is going to be a much better sequence even. I'm assuming we're going to do Belmont, but again, these are the kind I enjoy because we got all kind of different types of races, turf, dirt, route, sprints, stakes, you name it, it was in here. So always good to expand your handicapping arsenal.
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, these are fun sequences to talk about, even if they're really difficult to hit. But sometimes those are the best ones to play because if you take a swing and you have some good ideas throughout, you can make something happen. But definitely, the strike rate just descends a little bit when you consistently take swings at sequences like this one at Belmont on Saturday, because there is the potential for some chaos in multiple legs. Well, Craig, I had fun discussing this, as you said, and I really am looking forward to that Belmont Stakes card next week. Fingers crossed. It feels like multiple races are coming up very strong. Probably not the small fields that we had last year, maybe in too many of those graded stakes races. It feels like we're going to be getting a few more competitive races this year, so I'm definitely looking forward to that, because you want these days to have the stars, but also to be interesting handicapping affairs, and I feel like we might get that. And the Belmont Stakes in particular, I mean, I haven't made a pick yet. I'm still kind of going through the contenders and familiarizing myself with all of them, but that's going to be an interesting race to handicap if that field holds together. 10 signed on, and I think there are a lot of runners with chances in there.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And looking at some of the prospective fields, it does seem like a much better day, where last year was just kind of a showcase of the big names and most of them delivered. I think this is going to be a much better handicapping sequence. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. We haven't talked about it. Are we doing 1 or 2 shows next week?
That's a good question, Craig. I would lean towards doing 2 shows next week, a traditional pace cast, and then maybe we could do a Belmont Stakes and Pick 5 sequence forecast, just because, the Belmont Stakes, I think, is being drawn on Tuesday next week, whereas they drew the Derby and Preakness cards on Monday, so we'll take advantage of that extra day to play with. So we'll give you a little more content to listen to if that works for you, Craig.
Yeah, it works for me. I just wanted to try to figure it out. Rather than this way, our listeners know what to expect.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in this week to both the Pacecast and Forecast. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch TimeformUS Pacecast that I think we're planning is coming up next Tuesday.